Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable called Debt, Sustainability or Development. I'm very pleased to be with you this evening to talk about this subject of the debt. Why borrow money? When should you stop? For what reason? With what objectives should you go on getting into debt, whether you are a state or a company? These are the questions we're going to have during this panel with the wonderful speakers I'm going to talk about. So, Catherine, who is the coordinator of the session, she's LUBOCHINSKY, with the Circle of Economists. Next to us, or rather alongside Catherine, Mirela AGACHE-DURAND, you work for Groupama Asset Management. At a distance, and I hope it will work, you have Indermit GILL, who is an economist of the World Bank. Thank you for being with us, even at a distance. Can we hear you?
Hello.
Bonjour.
Oh, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Great. We hear you too.
Jong-Wha LEE, you work at the Korea University on the macro aspects. You work for the Asian Development Bank. Olivier PÉRONNET, also president of Finexi consultancy. And if you want translation, do not hesitate to go and get a headset. I've just said it in French, so if you don't speak French, you won't have understood me. So, Catherine, up to you to find the way we're going to debate in a few minutes. We promise. Let me start by asking a few questions. I'd just like to say that the timer has... So, do we have infinite time? So if you want to put the switch of time on. So started. So we'll start by asking a few questions to better try and understand the subject. The starting point of the session is that states, even those who are over in debt, and I won't talk about Africa, Latin America, or Asia, also countries who are overly in debt in Europe, they have massive needs for investment for their sustainable development. First thing, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the public debt, the sovereign debt, or talking about private debt, or both? And here I'll give you a revealing figure of why we have the question. The whole of the debts represented 100% of GDPs worldwide in 1970. 50 years later, 250% approximately. 50 points due to two crises, financial crisis and sanitary crisis. So we may have questions regarding sustainability. So these questions of sustainability must be approached not only with the criteria of the rate of indebtedness, which is not very revealing or explicit. Sustainability is the capacity to face commitments. Commitments not only from a financial point of view, sustainability of the sovereign debt. We see why the debt ratio doesn't work with the GDP. We're far from the 260% which we have in Japan. So there's not enough criteria. Often use the criteria of the service of the debt that we compare with revenue. When you talk about the sovereign debt, we will compare it with the budgetary income, but that is not sufficient either. And it's insufficient because economics are not accounting. In economics, you must always reason in a dynamic way, and the dynamics of the debt ratio depends on the differentiations between the growth rate of economy and the debt. The privileged in Africa who have access to foreign capital have large risks ratio. So unless you have a growth rate higher than 10%, the rate of interest, you will have to perform miracles. If you can have an economic growth higher than the interest rate, you don't have the problem of sustainability. And to oppose sustainability and development, lose its meaning. There's no opposition in this case. And I've been told I've already used up my time. Let's say that to conclude that we need to have sustainability and development, but everything is linked to how we are going to finance it all. We have 240 billion per year until 2030 for emerging and developing countries, excluding China. And the International Monetary Fund made a big effort because they talked about resilience and sustainability, because they paid 1.4 billion. So we are far from what is necessary. So what are the alternative funding systems available? What will be the role of international organizations and multilateral organizations? How can you convince advanced countries who have a difficult debt position to contribute to funding the less advanced countries, because we are all interdependent? And I'll get back to that if I've got time. Last question. Can companies and, say, more globally private funders, cannot they help this sustainable development? I know it's difficult, so thank you, Catherine. So, you see the angles to approach the problem. So what is your approach? How do you apply this issue? Mirela, sorry. Let me talk about the debt, public debt. I'll let Olivier deal with the question of debt of businesses. The debts in developed countries. Catherine, you talked about the fact that we had global problems which led to an increase in debt. We had the financial crisis. We had to get the economies out of this recession with the support of the states. There was COVID. The United States had a plan to reduce it, and there's also a recovery plan for Europe. And there's a lot of support to populations provided during COVID. So it wasn't possible for governments to be absent during the period. We will have understood that the geopolitical environment was also moved a lot because the arrival of the war in Ukraine, the military spending has gone up in all of the countries. It means public effort. Bad news is that we cannot sum up the past. You talked about the question, should we stop getting into debt? But we have the three transitions, the environmental transition, digital and democratic, which cannot not be funded. But governments need to play a part there. So that is the major issue in 3 minutes. The solution to the equation is something we'll try to find. I'm not sure 3 minutes will be enough, but at least the debate is the past, and also how we look into the question of debt in the future. Indermit, if you're not too far away, how do you see that subject? What is your analysis?
Thank you very much for asking me that question, and thank you for asking me to participate in this conference. So I'll try to be brief in my responses. So I think that the first is that to address this question in a helpful manner, we have to distinguish between poor developing countries like Ethiopia, middle-income emerging markets like Kenya and India, and high-income advanced economies like France and the US, right? So we have to recognize that actually these economies have essentially just two things in common. The first is that all three groups today have debt levels that are too high, both for sustainability and for development. And the second one is that all of these countries have much lower growth rates today than they did in the last decade. And that growth rate in turn was actually much lower in the decade before that, right? So I'll just say a few quick things about the first part is about their debt, the second part is about their growth, and then the third part is about their sustainability. So when you measure things correctly, you actually start to see that countries like Ethiopia's external debt is about 80% of its GDP. Kenya's and India's public debt is about 100% of its GDP, of their GDP, and France's public debt is getting to the vicinity of around 120, 115, 120%. Now, I think in the simplest term, the way that we see these things is that these ratios are about twice as high as they should be, right, for each of these groups of countries. The second thing that they have in common is that their growth rates have been falling steadily, right? And that's true across the board. That's true of low-income countries, for middle-income countries, as well as for high-income economies. And growth is important, both for debt and for development. First, because debt, after all, is just a claim on future output. And if future output is higher than today's, it's far more likely that you'll be able to service your debt, right? And the second thing, of course, is that to the extent that we have these big development needs, big needs to fight climate change and so on, that requires finance, and you don't get that either from public or private sources if your economy is not growing, right? Now, if you look at the growth rate of these countries, you find that the output growth rate of developing economies has fallen from about 6% in the 2000s to 5% in the 2010s, down to about 4% in this decade, right? For poor countries in Africa especially, the growth rate in output has barely kept up with their population growth. So in fact, for the poorer countries in sub-Saharan Africa, their per capita income today is lower than it was back in 2015, okay? And there's a risk that there will be another lost decade, just like the last decade. Now, in the case of emerging economies, except for countries like India, you see that the growth rate has been falling in those countries too. The sharpest fall, of course, is China, where the growth rates over the last 3 decades have fallen from about 7% to from about 9% to 7% to about 5% in this decade. And if you look at growth rates in growth rate in the high-income advanced economies, that growth rate has actually dropped in half as compared to the first decade of this, and that growth rate would be pretty much zero in places like France and UK and Germany, and it would be zero for the advanced economies were it not for the US. So for all of these reasons, I think there is a big problem, and just the thing that I want to just end with is that if you look at sustainability, perhaps the best way to assess how resilient these countries are to natural disasters is to look at the annual cost of natural disasters, what it was 15 years ago and what it is today. And if you look at that, what we found is that for low-income countries, the annual cost was about 0.6% of GDP 10, 15 years back. Today, it is twice that much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I'll stop. Yeah.
Est-ce que je peux vous demander peut-être un...
Could I ask you, continue with this analysis, thanks to your position, do you have a different analysis for Asia?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important forum. I think it's first of all, let me emphasize that the issue of sustainability is very important, but not just for certain group of emerging economies, but also applied to advanced economies and everywhere, including Asian economies. We are discussing development sustainability and fiscal debt sustainability. They are interrelated because the fiscal resources are very important to address the issues related to the sustainable development. What is the sustainable development? Sustainability of development is basically improving quality of life for current generation without sacrificing the need of future generations. But look at the current economic system everywhere. They are addressing the future generations' needs. We are discussing about environmental sustainability, social sustainability, as well as economic sustainability. It's just emphasized by other people. There are declining economic growth, increasing social conflict, and then deterioration of the environment. So we need to address these problems. And then sustainability issues requires some coordinated actions, not just at the national level, but also global levels. So my understanding of this sustainability issue is not just related to the fiscal debt sustainability, because fiscal resources is an instrument, and then this address the important objectives of the sustainable economic and social development everywhere.
Merci. Olivier, avec toutes ces problématiques, est-ce qu'elles peuvent s'appliquer aussi au monde de l'entreprise?
Can all this also address the business world? I'm very pleased to take part in this prestigious panel. Maybe to answer the question, in the light of what has already been said, so to define a level of sustainability of a debt is a question of circumstances, specific circumstances, and there is something which is quite certain. Maybe there was a point not mentioned, is that who has it and what is validated of it. We heard that Ghana has defaulted with 24% debt, and if the United States are managing with 120%, which is similar to the French economy, as this figure of 120 sees the growth in the same way to support it. The problem of public debt and business debt, they face the same thing from a macroeconomic point of view. How are we going to fund the consequences of climate change, geopolitical instability, inflation? How we'll get better efficiency of public spending, reduce spending to encourage emergence, improve infrastructure for health, and improve access to education, for instance. How can you make sure that taxes are put to better use? Otherwise, the fiscal aspect will have a disastrous effect on growth. Businesses, because of what they carry solutions for their own funding. And to get to this, states are the ones that carry the public debt, but they have an important part to play in the economic choices as a strategist, as a state which regulates, and the cost of measures and the directions given, as well as the funding means made available, need to be distinguished. So the range of tools, at the risk of pushing open doors, exists at businesses at many levels. And maybe we'll get back to the subject later. You could have gone, well, what are the solutions? What can we do? What are the priorities we need to define? Priorities, well, business faced with an environment given by the state will be reactive. If the economy is dynamic and carry them along, it's fairly simple. But raising debt in developed economies, at least, and more generally, the funding or financing of companies, go through a number of tools. And sorry once again for declaring what's obvious. For the stock market is one thing, and so even if it's been more difficult, it's been 18 months raised more recently, against 20 in the past. It's a tool for funding companies. There's a new phenomenon when we see the interest rates going up and there's a volatility of the private debt, the shares of the price have gone up, allow a risk profitability situation which is favorable, particularly in the capital structure and with the appreciation of the risk. In the phenomenon which I think are important is also a number of funds which have had a different years, have had records in the previous years. 2003, it was historical. So with these instruments, we see the appetite of investors for long-term and risk covering. Infrastructure have a good coverage of inflation as well, and with tremendous means, as we mentioned earlier. So what are the solutions that you are thinking of, Mirela? I think we agreed on one point with Olivier. We have to look who is going to invest. You have to look at the attitude of an investor, the person lending money, and that is very important to gain their trust. And that is why effectively today we're talking about the question of a monetary debt, what we're going to pass on to the future generation, how we make sure that the money lenders still trust such a government to lend money in the future, but we cannot limit it to that. I think we need to look at debt from a more holistic point of view. It is a monetary debt. It's also another type of debt, a state which stops investing, for instance, for energy transition, will leave a more vulnerable country to the future generations. And if we do not take into consideration what my neighbor was saying earlier about future generations to have a sustainable growth, it means that we are leaving them a country in a difficult position. So we need to work on, have to be careful to that. There is not only one leverage system to deal with the global problem. There are far more. And we have to consider what we call the intangible assets. We saw in the financial crisis the fact that you are transparent is a very important intangible asset. We also see that during the crisis of the sovereign debt in Europe, the good governance was also an important asset. And peace is also an intangible asset which is extremely important. It's difficult to imagine lending money to a country which is not protecting its peace. We have to find how to attract investors, projects for investments which need to be profitable, which lead to economic growth, because it's with economic growth that you can then fund medium-term and long-term debts. And the public industrial policies must be well considered, medium and long term, using all of the means available. We talked about business, but at country level and governments, we can think of the public-private partnerships which can be implemented to fund infrastructure and long-term investments. Another thing, for instance, in developed countries, we have high savings rates. So there's a lot of savings, for instance, in the United States, a lot of savings which could be used to invest projects in the future. But here you need trust, you need profitable projects, and you need a European regulation. So we are calling for recovery of the capital market union, because that will mean that we do not have a fragmented European market, and we can support the development. And then, in effect, maybe we should accept from time to time to have a higher level of debt. It's not the end-all of sustainability and economic development if we have a trajectory showing that growth is there and financing the projects which allow short-term and long-term development. I think the key word of Mirela is trust. So, you would see transparency. What can we say?
Thank you. Well, I think it's achieving both development sustainability and fiscal debt sustainability is both important. If we look at the highly indebted countries, they need to spend a lot of money for debt service payment, which will divert their resources from investing in essential social infrastructure and also environment. So how to resolve these issues? Of course, I mean, we need to get good information about what's the really needs for those countries to address those problems. But it's not just those highly indebted countries. In many countries, they need to have appropriate actions and sufficient financing and good governance to address these sustainability issues. So, for example, in many countries, there are hidden debt. Even in China, now we are discussing sustainability issues. China was known for very high growth, but now they are suffering from slowing down of economic growth, emphasized by the World Bank chief economist. But it's still high number, but their social inequality is very high. Also, environmental issues they need to address. I mean, so, but some countries, we don't know what is the really current situation of the hidden debt. For example, China, there are hidden debts in the local government. So I think it's the first important priority of action is getting to the national level. They need to improve the growth, of course, growth potentials, because they need to develop the economic and human resources and also technological development to address their stagnant economic growth. That will reduce the public debt to GDP ratio because the GDP will increase. But the fiscal reform is also important in many countries. They cannot really collect the sufficient resources through the tax system, and also there are very wasteful fiscal expenditures. So we need to address these problems. But let me just get to the global effort, because the global organizations such as World Bank, IMF, G7 and G20 need to address these problems. They need to, of course, collect the good informations in the worldwide to address the sustainability issues. It's not just for the current situation, but also in the future. What will be happen in the future, in 20 years later, 30 years later, in the worldwide? What's the problem in Africa and Asia? So we need to look at the future. And then globally, especially the financing and it's very important issues. We cannot really leave this issue to the private creditors, because the private flows are always fluctuating, and then depending on the financial market situations, emerging countries cannot really rely on the private resources of financing. So this multilateral financing is very important to address the basic important social needs to achieve the both development and fiscal debt sustainability. So let me start.
Olivier, une réaction rapide, vous vouliez?
Oui, je pense qu'il y a un exemple en France.
I think there's an example in French that we have on the porosity of all of this and the collective importance on public debt and what we put up opposite it, which are the assets. If we look at our nuclear sector in our country, which for 20-25 years was neglected and even maybe deteriorated, today, by relaunching with 100 billion as an investment envelope and having taken the decision to nationalize, I think it's a whole sector that's starting up again and where the startup nation can find its place. There are solutions in future on small nuclear plants. We see a new economy being born that's fully private, that can provide solutions. So from the point of view of financing, if we start with nationalization, it's the state that takes on board the risk. But in terms of risk sharing and opportunities, we have a new sector with new energy that shows that we can create assets. So giving our date, this could be a first approach. This nuclear sector is one with high valuation, and it's vital for our ecological transition. So I'm going to turn again To you, Indermit, I can't interrupt you. So if you can give us a brief answer, please.
Yes. So I think that, again, I think it's very important to think of low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. So if you look at low-income countries, essentially, you have to help these countries make their people more resilient to things like climate change and so on, while recognizing that they don't have room for more borrowing and things like that. And I think it's very important to understand the big differences between these countries and countries like France. So, for example, France spends something like $10,000 per student per year. If you look at the typical low-income country, it spends $50 per student per year. So France spends on a student in one day what a country like Mali spends in a whole year. So I think it's very important to actually put a lot of emphasis on things like education, health, and basic infrastructure, especially energy in these countries. Then when it comes to countries like India, you can't expect them to do the same things that countries like France and all are doing today in terms of cutting emissions, but you can expect them to cut pollution, local air pollution. So for example, local air pollution in Paris is much, much lower than local air pollution in places like Delhi or even in Beijing today. And that's the big part that I think that these countries need to do to make life better for their citizens, to make things more sustainable in some sense. And I think it's very important for countries like France and others to not just to cut emissions, which I know France is doing pretty well at, but also to grow. Because if you don't end up growing, you don't create a dynamism in the world. And that dynamism is very, very important for these poorer countries to grow out of debt, to grow out of grow out of being very vulnerable to things like rapid climate change. Without that growth, so we find, for example, that during periods in which countries like France and others have grown highly or well, those are the times that other countries also, the poorer countries also do well at. So I think for the high-income countries, it is very important for them to be economically dynamic, to actually have high economic growth rates as well. Those are what I would call priorities for these countries.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your concise answer. So we can now take some questions from the room. Is there a microphone that we can pass around? So we'll bring a microphone. There's the lady in green who was wanting to ask a question, sir, and then the lady afterwards. I wanted to ask a question about the role of the state as the last insurer, so for the health crisis and the financial crisis, for risks that are taken by a country, is the insurer of last resort. So are there ideas to try to dissociate the role of the state as the insurer of last resort so that insurance companies can take this risk and get the companies who are taking the risk to pay in the end, and which would be reflected in the premium that they're paying for this type of insurance? Mirela, you're closer to insurance. Maybe you'd like to answer. So at Groupama, we insure the agricultural world, and they're dealing with a significant problem today. That is that sometimes in agriculture, there are risks that we can't insure anymore. So Groupama and other French insurance companies have worked with the public authorities to rework on the insurance system, because you have to understand that a company has inherent risks, because if they don't have insurance, if you have a farm and, for instance, your crop of the year is destroyed because of a fire or because of freezing conditions or rain, if we can't insure these agricultural risks, the farm will not be able to last over time and will never get insurance again over the long term. The government has worked. The government is the insurer of last resort. Everyone has to come with and make efforts on this. The farmer has to think about the way they're organizing the farm, their industry, in order to take into account the risks. The insurance company will then take on board a part of these risks, and then after that, it's the government that will come in with the higher tranche. But everyone has to make an effort in view of climate change. If you're growing lettuce in southern France where it's 40 degrees, you're not going to succeed. You can't grow lettuce here anymore because you won't get crops. You're going to have to change your crops and grow lettuce in the north. So everybody has to find how they can reorganize the system, and the professions are organized by branch to break down insurability to make sure that everyone's playing their role. There was a question from the lady at the back. Hello? Mr. Olivier PÉRONNET proposed strategies for solutions for developing countries, like the stock exchange or funds that we could do to alleviate debt. But I would like to know what you think about the fact that we could have our own currency. Would that allow us to bring debt down for underdeveloped countries in Africa, or would it be able to mitigate the risk of the insolvency of our debt? Can private equity help solve the problem of non-solvability of the debt of African countries? No, more the fact that we would have our own money, our own currency. Could that bring down the risk associated with the debt of our country or the insolvency of our debt?
I think that's a very important issue because many emerging economies have a foreign currency denominated debt. They don't have own international currency. So you need to look at the exchange rate and also what happened to the global financial markets. For example, if U.S. increase interest rate, that burden all of a sudden increase. You need to pay more for foreign currency denominated debt. That's maybe unfair, but it also reflects the current monetary system, basically dominated by a few international currency. So very ideal case is if any emerging countries own its own international currency, that would resolve these issues we call currency mismatch problems. But it will take time. One African countries cannot do it. Whole African countries may need to get together and discuss these issues. But it took a long time, even for European countries, to get into the euro. So more importantly, I think is the multilateral lending institutions like IMF could use its resources, like a special drawing right, that it has its own basic currency, may allocate to support the African countries to get out of these current debt issues. So we can discuss these issues globally because it requires some global coordinations and cooperations.
Je crois qu'il y avait encore... Alors, on va en prendre une ou deux, si c'est très rapide. Près de vous...
Oui, bonjour. Je voulais juste poser la question de savoir si demain, les pays des BRICS arrivaient à créer la nouvelle Banque mondiale, est-ce qu'on va parler dette comme on parle ce soir? Voilà.
Je pense qu'il va falloir préciser un peu votre question. Il y a clairement des doutes sur ça.
Can you please repeat your question about, so you have a guest from the World Bank, and there are some countries, BRIC countries, who want to create a bank, their own bank, to also lend to developing countries. I think of China. So would it be a good idea for China to create a competing global bank? I'm not saying good or bad, but will we talk about debt in the same way we're talking about it now? We're talking about debt because we have the IMF and the World Bank. and we're following their lines. But in future, if there was another World Bank, what would we do?
Okay, thank you. So there was no translation, so I didn't hear, but now I understand your questions. So there are some initiatives by the BRICS countries. Also, there's a Chinese effort to create the multilateral institutions. It's called AIIB, and there are also BRICS Bank. So if they could lend the money additionally to the African countries, they can help to build the infrastructure and also address the environmental issues. But that's the one advantage. But another issue is if this additional lending cannot create the value added to those countries, these countries can easily get into the debt traps. So currently there are a lot of debate whether this bilateral lending or from these multilateral institutions, especially initiated by China, really lead to effective lending, really helping these emerging countries. So it's going back to the transparency issues, governance issues, effective lending issues. So it's having the more additional source of the multilateral lending could be one advantage, but to make it more effective, there are a lot of issues to resolve altogether. So let me get started.
Une toute dernière question.
Last question. I have a question about time concordance. We say we've accumulated debt, there's not much growth right now. The sustainability means that the interest rates have to stay fairly close to the growth rate. That's the past. But now we're being told that there are lots of projects that need financing, so we need to find financing. This is okay, so it's good. There's lots of savings around the world, but these people who have their savings might be a bit greedy and want to have a proper remuneration for lending their savings. So how do we find a balance between the way to the past and the refinancing the past and the financing that's necessary for future projects?
Olivier, Mirela.
Olivier?
On va vous répondre à deux.
So we'll answer both of us. The balance is essential when you try to work on these projects. You need to have project discipline. These projects must compensate for the risk that the saver is taking. People with savings are not all capitalists with huge houses and a lot of money. We're talking about the savings of normal French people who save for their retirement, who save for rainy days. So you cannot treat this as though it was free money that we don't know what to do with. We need to be rigorous in terms of the projects that are proposed for financing in order to draw these money from the savers. You have to be transparent about the projects. There has to be a good return on investment. And there's a duty to accompany and to explain these projects that are brought to market for savings. Secondly, it's true that the combination between private and public financing is something that could be successful because you have this complementarity that means that sometimes public financing can be there just for the high-risk tranches that are more difficult to, where it's more difficult to find private investors. But we've seen in the past that this type of method can work. Like all investments, there is no such thing as zero risk, and that's why there's always a yield, return on investment. But this mechanism has already been successful in the past. To add to what was just said, I think that the answer has multi-forms. We need to put risk back in the middle of the economic debate. There's a category of investors, the richest ones, who can accept a high level of risk. And we have to accept the idea of taking risk. Where things are more complex, and when we're talking about savings, pension funds, etc., that have to report to their contributors, and these people who are going to live from the return on investment, the question that you asked earlier about the state as the guarantor of last resort, they have to be at the end of this spectrum too. Indeed, the state has to guarantee what we need in terms of risk-taking for these investments to take place, but at the same time, the saving that could be put towards risky investments needs to be sufficiently incentivized for people to want to use it and not be the primary responsibility of the state. This idea of risk in our current economy and with transformation and all the topics that we have to deal with, we need to put risk and acceptance of risk at the middle of the debate, and I think this is a very important topic. So there's no... The answer depends on who the people with the savings are and what the strategic needs are in order to find balance and a palette of solutions that is not unique, but that has many forms. So we're at the end of our discussion. I'm going to ask each of you what your takeaway message is, and I'm going to make the question a bit harder than the one we prepared. The political landscape may change in France. What would you say to politicians in charge of the debt? Who wants to answer this question? I hadn't planned it. I'll start, because we need to take risks. What I want to say to the state is that they have a legitimacy to be strategic in the fields that are of general interest to the population, but at the same time, they must facilitate growth, absolutely. Even if the level of public debt is high in France today, everything is relative. We have to look at all the assets that we have to offset this debt. The representative of the IMF said that France is spending a lot on education, and this is a real asset. So I think we have to be strategic and facilitate growth. Secondly, as a manager of the state, they have to manage public money efficiently. The public funds that are put somewhere, invested somewhere, must be effective. It's a cultural contract, and they have to regulate what they must regulate. It's the government's role in a world where this role is important and the government is legitimate to play this role. Indermit, what is your takeaway from this roundtable discussion?
So I really like the panelists' comments. I don't have anything to disagree with anybody, with what anybody said. So I guess to actually respond to the question about would it be good for other lenders to come, other multilateral or bilateral lenders to enter the market? And the answer is yes. If you look at the previous experience, you find that countries that actually have good governance mechanisms or debtors that have good governance mechanisms, they have tended to make good use of this credit. Those countries that have weak governance mechanisms at home, they have tended to get into debt traps and so on. So I think a really important agenda for organizations like the World Bank and so on is to strengthen internal governance. The other part that you asked is what would you tell the new people in France and so on about how to sort of regulate international debt? And I think the main thing to take away there is that because of changes in international debt markets, huge changes as compared to 20 years ago, the current system of restructuring debt is defunct and it needs to be rethought. And I think what should happen is that any new government in France ought to be thinking about that as an important matter. Thank you very much for inviting me for this.
Jong-Wha, qu'est-ce que vous voulez nous...
Jong-Wha, what would you like to give as your takeaway message?
Well, I cannot give any advice to the French situation, but in broadly speaking, there are always problems with the politicians because the politicians care not just in the non-democracy, but also in democracy. They care about elections and they are talking about the current issues. They are relatively ignorant about the needs of future generations because they cannot really get more votes raising these issues. So they are usually, not just in the Western countries, but also in East Asia, including my country, South Korea, they don't really care about the needs of future generations, including environment and the social conflict and also the demographic issues. I mean, these are the very important issues. So I think it's I always think it's the building good institutions, and then the people's will is very important because they can give the pressure on the politicians. So in that sense, democracy has a value because the politicians should listen to the people's needs. So in that sense, I think it's the future is not destined. I mean, I think some people see the current situation will continue, and then the problems in African countries will be deteriorated. But I don't believe maybe future is in the Africa, future is in the emerging economies. But we need to build the good institutions at the national level as well as the global level. I think that's important. And then the education is also important because not just for the formal education, but in the society, we need to learn what's the current need to build the better institutions.
Mirela, qu'est-ce que vous retenez? Quel est votre message fort?
Mirela, what's your takeaway message? Solving the problem of the debt is not easy. It's a planetary problem. It's not just France's problem. Every country has this problem. If there was an easy solution, we would already know it. The message, my first message for the public authorities is that this problem will not have an easy solution. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be painful to solve it, but there will be efforts required. And you shouldn't let people believe that there's a magic solution to solve these problems. However, don't fall into defeatism to say it's the end of the world and we don't know how we're going to come back to rigor and growth that's sustainable. It's the opposite. We have we're lucky in Europe to have intelligence, education, industry, savings. We need to use these energies that tend to divide themselves. We need to bring them together to find the solutions for the future. Catherine, you need to conclude. You've got 2 minutes. Fabulous. What I would remember from this discussion is the time frame shock. Everyone agrees that the state can spend, but the spending has to be effective. The problem of the effectiveness of public spending is that they produce their effects in the long term when you're investing in what we call the future, education, innovation. The profitability only comes in after a few years. And so this criteria of profitability that was raised by everyone with a quasi-financial vision only, saying, how can we integrate other types of criteria other than financial in the profitability and risk calculations, knowing that we have to think about the long term and overcome the budget restrictions and financing limitations that we have everywhere. Thank you. So you can applaud our panel. Thank you, all 4 of you.